I want to start today with a confession. Now, I have found recently that what's been happening is sometimes I'm waking up in the middle of the night and I feel fear. Now, some of you are relieved, aren't you? Because you're thinking, well, we know Paul and we were expecting something far worse than that. I think there's probably some of you that are thinking, well, hold on a minute. Doesn't the Bible say, fear not, 366 times? Once for every day of the year and then a spare. And then there's some of you that are thinking, well, actually, isn't there places in the Bible where actually Jesus tells us to fear not, and he says it in a way that is a command? But I suspect, actually, if you're honest, there are some of you that are thinking to yourselves, yeah, me too. But I don't want to just start with a confession. I also want to start with a bit of disclaimer. You see, I'm going to be talking today about fear and about the situation that we find in the world that we live in. And I'm very aware that for many of you that are listening to these sort of videos, life is actually tough. There are things going on that actually are really hard. And actually, if we're honest, are things that perhaps are right to be fearful of. So I just want to say right at the start, please, in no way is this to diminish any of the things that you're going through. But I hope that this talk that I've prepared will be helpful in some way if, like me, there are times at the moment where you feel fear. So what is it that you're fearful of? Well, maybe it is the war in Ukraine and what's going on over there. You see, there is so much that is out of our control with that situation, and I wonder, is Putin really mad enough to escalate the war still further? And yet, from recent evidence, we kind of think, yeah, probably he is. Perhaps it's the cost of living crisis. Perhaps your income is being stretched. You may be fortunate enough that it's not really affecting you, and praise God if that's the case. But you know, on an almost daily basis, I'm meeting people who are struggling. They've got full-time jobs, they work hard, and yet actually with the recent cost of living crisis, things have been very difficult for them. Maybe it's your career. I have to say this is one that I struggle with a lot, being in full-time ministry, doing things outside with people in the community, and often wondering, actually, am I having any real effect? Should I maybe be considering something else? Is God really in this? And it's very easy, isn't it, to worry about the careers that we have and the direction that we're going. And what about COVID? Well, COVID may seem a long time ago now, but let's be honest, it's still there. Maybe there's a new strain round the corner that'll be far worse than the last one. So if you weren't feeling fear before you started listening to this talk, I'm guessing you possibly are now. My apologies for that. But it does remind me of that famous movie quote, be afraid, be very afraid. Because the world that we currently live in, do you know, there is no end of things that we can be fearful of. So I think to myself, often when I'm up in the morning, early in the morning, lying in bed and things are going through my mind, you know, I need to have a plan. I need to have a plan and a strategy because there has to be a better way to deal with this fear. But maybe we also at times tell ourselves, well, actually, if I had enough faith, then maybe I wouldn't feel this fear because Jesus said, fear not. Well, that isn't always that helpful either because all that does is just make me feel like I'm not a particularly good Christian. So I want to today talk about how we respond to fear when it's going on in our lives and there's situations that we're facing. But let's just first consider what fear is. You see, fear, when you think about it, is just a respect for something's power. It's a respect for the way that something that might be happening can affect your life. So for example, if you take something like the stove at home, you don't put your hand on the stove when it's on because you're fearful of getting burnt, because you understand the power and the reality and the way it can affect your life of heat. It's like those times when you climb a tall building and you look over the edge or you look out the window and you get that kind of funny feeling inside. It's simply because you respect the power of gravity and the effect that it can have on you. So fear is just a respect for something's power and the effect it can have on you. So perhaps the question that we need to ask ourselves is, what power do I respect most? You see, we have a choice. When these things come into our lives, we have a choice. It's the way that God made us. And I think there's two possible choices. The first one is flight. Flight means that you say to yourself and you hold your hands up and say, it's not my fault, I can't fix it, I'm the victim, I need to get out of here, I'm giving up, that's it, me done. The other choice is fight. And if you choose to fight, it means that you're going to look this thing in the eye, that you're going to confront it, that you're going to go and do battle with it. It means that you have decided that this thing, whatever it is, however big or however small, is not going to be allowed to take and destroy parts of your life. You're going to fight. And that's a choice that we have. Now let's just take a time out there, because you see, I reckon when I said that you need to fight, there's a whole bunch of you out there that are saying to yourselves, yeah, but how can I fight? How can I fight all of these things that are out of my control? How can I fight a global pandemic? How can I fight the financial situation? How am I supposed to fight the war in Ukraine? And I get it. I get it, and I agree. You see, there is absolutely nothing you can do about many of the things that go on. You see, you can't do anything about a global pandemic, because let's be honest, if you could, you would have done. There are many things that go on in our lives that are out of our control. But the question I'm asking this morning isn't how do we change our circumstances so these things aren't there anymore. The question I'm asking this morning is, how do I fight fear and worry and anxiety when these things are going on? And you know, for me, it always comes back to the same thing. You have a choice. You have a choice. Flight, give up, resign yourself to the situation, or fight, to take hold of that situation somehow and make a decision, a conscious decision, to fight in some way and to do something. And if fear is simply the respect of something's power and the effect that it can have on us, then surely what we need to do is to find something that has more power and can have a different effect on us. So you have this thing causing you anxiety, the thing that you're afraid of, and you need to take hold of it. It's what the Apostle Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians 10 when he says that we have to take these thoughts captive. But you see, we don't just take hold of these things and sort of lay them down. That's taking them captive. I believe that the choice that we have is that we have to take them and lay them down, but then we have to take hold of something else. Something that has more power and can have more effect and can be a more positive influence on our lives when we're feeling that fear. And you know, I'm probably going to lose a few of you when I say those things, because there's a few of us out there that we're called control freaks. I'm in that club, that's me. And I like to be in control. And we sort of think to ourselves, well, there must be something that I can do. There must be something that I can do that changes that situation. There must be some ways I can manipulate things or change things, or the actions I take or the words that I say that can change that. And we like to be in control. But you know, if we're really honest, there are many aspects of our lives where we are not in control. The global pandemic has surely taught us that. You see, you could stay healthy and fit and go to the gym 3 times a week, but if a cancer cell in your body starts to develop, there is nothing you can do about that. And there's nothing you have done to cause that. Maybe a better analogy is that of driving a car. You see, you could stay to the speed limits, you could be the safest driver in the world, but if a drunk driver one day careers into your side of the road and crashes into you, do you know it wasn't your fault? There is nothing you can do about that. It was out of your control. And there isn't a person this morning that's watching this video that I'm sure in some way can't relate to that. Because stuff happens in life. It's just a fact of life. And generally when it does, it's not our fault and it's not in our control. Even Jesus said that these things would happen. Jesus said in John 16:33, he said, I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble. But take heart, I have overcome the world. You see, he says in this world, it doesn't matter how much faith you have, it doesn't matter how much God loves you. He just says in this world, scary, hard, troubling things are going to happen. But we can take heart. We can take heart because Jesus has beaten this world. And it's a choice. It's a response. It's the way that we take hold of these things, and we have to say to ourselves, I have to choose. And when we do, it can lead to peace. It's like Jesus is saying, you're going to have trouble. That's just how it's going to be. But then he says, but. And that but that Jesus says is a big word. Because if he hasn't said that, then the passage is going to read something like, you're going to have trouble. And it's going to take hold of you. And you're going to be full of anxiety and fear. And it's going to trouble you greatly. And you'll probably wake up at 4 a.m. like I do at times. And those things will race through your minds and you'll have that fear. But he doesn't say that. He says, but. He says, but I have beaten the world. So you see, the normal response doesn't need to be as it's always been. We don't need to have that fear because there's now a new normal that we can have because of Jesus and because of what he's done. So take heart. Don't give up. You don't have to be afraid. Remember, hold on to this truth that he brings us hope. And Jesus says, choose me, trust me. Why? Why should we ever dare to do that? Because he has beaten the world. You see, there's 2 deals on the table. And when it comes to dealing with fear, we have a choice. The choice is flat surrender, give up, and take flight. The other choice is to fight. Don't give up. I'm going to choose. I choose to remember that I can trust that Jesus is able to keep all of the promises that he's ever made to me. I choose to trust that in Jesus' words that he has beaten the world. I too in him can beat this world. See, when you think about it, in the Bible, there is story after story of people who face overwhelming odds. If you were a gambling man, and of course being a good Christian, I'm not, but if you were a gambling man, your money would not be on them. I think about Moses. Moses is trying to rescue his people and they're being chased by the mighty army. And in front of them is this wall of water. There's no way across. They're hemmed in. And yet, God intervenes and parts the sea and they cross. What about David and Goliath? You've got this young kid and then you've got this giant of a man. Your money should be on Goliath. And yet somehow David defeats him. What about Daniel thrown into a pit of lions? My money's on the lions. And then what about those 3 men that are thrown into the fire? There's no way that is going to end well. And yet every one of these scary stories that we read about in the Bible, something happens and their response should have been, come on, let's run, let's give up, let's flight. Let's curl up in a ball and give up because there's nothing I can do about this situation. And there's no way I can change what's going on. And yet they had a choice and they chose to fight. They chose to believe in a God that could save them. And that's exactly what happened. I love how David later on puts it like this when he fought Goliath. And David writes this. He says it in Psalm 56 and he says, when I'm afraid, I will trust in you. It's interesting that David says, when I'm afraid. You see, there is going to be times when we're afraid. That's just how life is. And life is tough at times. But David says, when I'm afraid, I will trust in you. You see, I don't suspect there's any one of you here this morning that can't relate to how tough it is. And I understand how tough it is. I understand how hard it is, because this is real stuff. But we get to choose 2 deals on the table: flight, give up, or fight. But we fight because we know that there is a God that has beaten this world. And he's the same God that rescued Moses. He's the same God that rescued David. He's the same God that gave Daniel the peace to be in the lion's den. And do you know, the same God that rescued them, the same God that can move mountains, the same God that can make a way where there is no way, do you know he can do that again? And he can do it for you, and he can do it for me. So we live in a scary world, and we can't fix it, and we can't change it. But we can do one thing, which is to hold on to the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and to trust and have faith in him that God doesn't change. We can have faith that God doesn't give up on people, that God is still there. The same God that rescued them is still there today. And it's faith and trust that what Jesus said is true, that he has defeated the world. A few months ago, I was awake early in the morning, and there were things going through my mind. You don't need to know what those things were. And I tried a number of different things, but after an hour or two, I still couldn't sleep. So I put a podcast on. And I was listening to a podcast, and I have to be honest, I can't remember what that podcast was about. But there was one line in the podcast that really spoke to me. And it was this: are you going to trust man, or are you going to trust God? My situation hadn't changed. But it was like in that moment God spoke directly to me, and I had changed. And I want to invite you, if you're watching this video, to just take a moment now, just to think about that thing that might be causing you fear and anxiety at the moment. But also, as you take hold of that thing, maybe you take hold of it and figuratively just lay it at your feet, to then remember what God has done for you in the past. Remember those things that you've read, those stories that you've heard of the ways that God has intervened. Because I believe that we can trust God today as we have in the past. And as hard as it is, you have a choice: flight, give up, resign yourself to the fear, or fight. Remembering that God loves you, God cares for you. Don't worry about tomorrow, because God will give you everything you need for today. Have a good week.